All right. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Red Hill Rediscovered program, home for a most noble patriot, Patrick Henry's life at Scotchtown. My name is Cody Youngblood, and I'm the Director of Historic Preservation and Collections here at Red Hill. And I'm joined with Elyse Werling, who is the recently promoted Director of Interpretation and Collections at Preservation Virginia. And we're very glad to have Elyse here with us. Now, Elyse, as I mentioned, is at Preservation Virginia, and she holds an MA in History and Museum Studies from Tufts University and a BA in History and Anthropology from Indiana University. She is an alumna of the Victorian Society of America's London Summer School and the Attingham Summer School. Her research has been published in Antiques and the Arts Weekly, Historic New England Magazine, and White House History Quarterly. Now, prior to moving to Richmond, she also worked at the White House Historical Society, George Washington's Mount Vernon, and Historic New England, where she opened the Eustis Estate Museum and Study Center. So at least with that, I will let you take it away. And folks, if you have any questions for Elyse as the presentation progresses, please leave them in the comment or the chat box, and they will be answered at the end. So Elyse, over to you.
All righty. Thank you, Cody. So I do have a slideshow to share with everyone as I go through the presentation. So I'm going to just upload that to our screen now. All righty. So I think we're ready to go. Thank you to Cody and Red Hill for inviting me to be here today to talk about Scotchtown. This is the year of Scotchtown for Preservation Virginia. So we're so excited to share more about it with people who might not know about this hidden gem in Hanover County. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is a picture of the house as we have it today, post-restoration with a new roof. As you can see, it's a very unique form and is very large. And that'll come into discussion as we go through the talk today. I'm going to give you a little bit of history of Scotchtown before, during, and after the Henry family's tenure there. And just all of the wild rides that this house has been on over the course of its existence. So first, I want to share a little about Preservation Virginia. We were founded in 1889, and we are the nation's oldest statewide preservation organization. We have 6 historic sites across the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we also have an advocacy and community engagement section of our professional staff here that assists in preservation needs and questions across the state as well. So these are our 6 sites. The first is Historic Jamestown, the actual fort site, if you've ever been there, perhaps on a field trip. So Historic Jamestown has its own staff of amazing archaeologists, and I work with the other 5 sites. That is the John Marshall House in Richmond, Virginia, the Cape Henry Lighthouse in Virginia Beach, Patrick Henry Scotchtown in Hanover County, and then Smith's Fort and Bacon's Castle, which are both in the wonderful Surrey County, Virginia region. So I do hope maybe you've been to one of these sites, maybe you've been to all of them. They are all open to the public, and we love having visitors come to our sites. So back to our subject of today, Scotchtown. As I mentioned, it is a large home, and I'll show you a little bit of the layout here so you can kind of imagine what it might be like walking in. We've got a massive central passage with 2 centered doors on either side that would have opened for breeze, circulation, a really large usable space. Then we have 4 rooms flanking either side of that central passage. We'll get into a little bit of the room use later on, but it is a large, large house. And this house would have been, maybe 3 or 4 times larger than the home the average Virginian was living in the 18th century. And when Patrick Henry and his family moved in 1771, They knew they were moving into a big house, and it was a statement about who they were and where they were going in life. So here is a little bit of a glimpse of where Scotchtown is. This is, in fact, the John Henry 1771 new and accurate map of Virginia. John Henry is, of course, the father of Patrick Henry. Wouldn't say it is the most accurate map of Virginia, but we like to use it because of John Henry's connection. So you can see our red dot towards the top. That is about where Scotchtown is located. The green dot that you see connected with the yellow line is the site of Newcastle, which is where we will talk a little bit about Newcastle later. It is where Patrick Henry's brother-in-law had a general store. And then way down in the corner is Williamsburg and Jamestown area, which of course Patrick Henry was frequenting quite a bit when he lived at Scotchtown. So you can really see the distance they would have taken. A little bit further south of the red and green dots, you can see Richmond, which was a much smaller city then, but still important due to an event that happened in 1775 that we'll talk about today. So, Scotchtown, pre-Henry history. We really have to start with all of the indigenous and Native American tribes that are located in the area. We know that the Monacan and the Manahoac tribes were active in the area. The Pamunkey are also near. And we also would like to say it's so important to mention that these tribes are still active and present in our community today, and especially across the greater Virginia community. So while they were there before the English were settled, they're still there now today. And we work with them in many facets of our work at Preservation Virginia. So in 1717, a man named Charles Chisholm was given a land grant of almost 10,000 acres. And that is the first documented legal land ownership that we have for the site where Scotchtown is today. We assume that Charles Chisholm did build a structure there by 1719 because that was the law. Whether or not he built Scotchtown or a portion of Scotchtown is unknown to us today. As we move on through time, the land that Scotchtown sits on, the plantation, the estate, eventually passes to Charles Chisholm's son, Colonel John Chisholm. And he was married to a woman named Elizabeth Randolph Chisholm, who is the lovely lady featured in this portrait from the collection of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. So aside from images of the Henry family and some of the later inhabitants, this is the only image we have of somebody who lived at Scotchtown before, or a woman who lived at Scotchtown before the Henrys moved in. Now, a little note to add is that we did undertake a recent dendrochronology study of Scotchtown, and this is a scientific process of dating a wood in a structure to get a date on when that structure might have been constructed. Unfortunately, our study was a little inconclusive, but it did reveal that one section within the east end of the current house standing today was built in the winter of 1742 to 43, which is during the tenure of Elizabeth Randolph Chisholm and Colonel John Chisholm. So that's why I wanted to mention that here, is they very likely had a hand in shaping Scotchtown into the physical structure that it is today. Now, what's interesting about that is by 1755, the Chisholms are moving to Williamsburg. They transfer Scotchtown to their son-in-law, John Robinson, but when they get to Williamsburg, they live here, this house on the right-hand side of our screen, the Chisholm Bucktrout House, which is currently part of Colonial Williamsburg. And I have to say, there are some remarkable similarities between that house and Scotchtown. Now, Colonial Williamsburg likes to say that This house was heavily restored and changed over the course of its existence. But I think the bulk of the form reminds me a whole lot of our structure that is Scotchtown. So just an interesting tidbit. This is a fun bit of Scotchtown's history. So as I said, the Chisels moved to Williamsburg, transfer Scotchtown to their son-in-law, John Robinson, who's a pretty prominent guy, and he is in fact the treasurer of Virginia. Unfortunately, he dies while in that office, and when he dies, the House of Burgesses discover that he embezzled over 100,000 pounds, which according to calculations today is approximately $29 million. So John Robinson dies. His estate is in flux because Virginia, the colony, has lost so much money that this man has embezzled. It is a huge scandal. And Scotchtown is held as collateral for that with his estate. Another interesting tidbit is right after Robinson dies, his father-in-law, the previous owner of Scotchtown, Colonel John Chisel, is arrested for murdering somebody else. And then he dies in October. So this family is going through quite an interesting time period. That could be a whole other presentation because it is so interesting. But really, the point of this is that Scotchtown is going up for auction to help pay back some of those debts that Robinson developed during his embezzling adventure. Therefore, we get to 1769. Executors of Robinson's estate are auctioning his possessions and lands off. And there is an auction of enslaved people at Scotchtown advertised in the Virginia Gazette, where 250 people are advertised as going up for auction. Now, we don't know if all those people worked at Scotchtown or if they worked at a variety of Robinson's lands across the state, which is more likely, but it is a very significant number of people who were held in bondage and auctioned from our property, and is something that we're trying to look into more as we research more about this house. Now, Scotchtown, as I said, went up for auction. And interestingly, in a study of all the properties listed in the Virginia Gazette for sale in the 18th century, Scotchtown is by far the largest. It's listed as a large, commodious dwelling house with 8 rooms on a floor, a very large passage, pleasantly situated, and all convenient outhouses. This is a view out of that, the very large passage today. And you can see that somebody who is aspiring politically, professionally, socially, such as Patrick Henry, might have seen this at the bargain price it was listed for and thought, that is a really great bargain. That is a great deal. And that's why in 1771, the Henry family purchases Scotchtown and move in. Now, I always like to point out that in this year that the family moves in, Patrick Henry is only 35 years old, and Sarah Henry, his wife, is 33. They have 5 children already, and the 6th is probably born right after or right before they moved to Scotchtown. We're not entirely sure of dates, but we know he was born in 1771, and that's Nettie. Their eldest is Martha, who was called Patsy. And then there's John, William, Annie, and Elizabeth, or Betsy. So this was a large family moving into a large house, and we like to think about all of the life that it was bringing into these rooms when they moved in. Also of importance to mention is we estimate that 15 to 20 enslaved people also moved to Scotchtown at this time. I have some names listed here, and this is a fairly up-to-date list of people that we have found that were enslaved by Patrick Henry over the tenure of his residency at Scotchtown. And as part of our new exhibit that is up at Scotchtown, we commissioned an artist to draw a portrait of Pedro, who we probably know the most about. And it's wonderful to have a face for Pedro. as we learn more about him and everyone else who was enslaved here. So we have Beck, two Bens, Dick, Dinah, Isaac, James, Jenny, Pedro, Will, Betty, Lucy, Hannah, and Jesse. Now, I mentioned before, I'll get a little bit more into the details of the rooms. I'm not going to go quite too deeply into them because hopefully you can come visit us for a tour. But as you can see here, we have a number of rooms interpreted. There are a few more besides what we have pictured here, but we have a parlor in the lower left, a formal dining room just opposite of that. And at the back of the house, we have the best bedchamber and a family dining room, which had a door leading out to the exterior kitchen. We assume that the other rooms in the house were bedrooms of some sort, simply because the family and their extended family members were often here, obviously living, and there was a lot of people living in this house. Now, we have very few primary sources to tell us about the Henrys' time when they lived at Scotchtown, but one of the best is this account book. So this account book is Patrick Henry's account at his brother-in-law, John Sim's store in Newcastle, which I highlighted on that map at the beginning of the presentation. What I love about this account book, aside from the fact that it lists everything that Patrick Henry bought and sold to this store in our Scotchtown time period, is the fact that it is labeled His Excellency Patrick Henry at the top. And I'm not sure if that was made in jest, as John Sim was a good friend of Patrick Henry, or if in fact he did call him His Excellency. But I think that's just a funny thing that makes me smile when I see that, because it seems like something that one friend would joke to another about. Now, as I said, this is our best insight into what was going on at the house here, because very few letters from the Henry family exist at this time. And I like this particular entry from September of 1773, when we know that debited was a large china bowl, 2 tin coffee pots, and several pewter dishes, and credited to Henry's account was chocolate, 200 herrings, 1 quart mug, and 1 sack bag. Interestingly, we do have 2 china bowls in our collection that have Patrick Henry provenance. One is on loan from the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, but we like to wonder, perhaps one of those china bowls was the one purchased at this store in September of 1773. So, as I said, we're moving into 1773. Again, very few documents exist about the Henry family's life at Scotchtown, but a recent exciting addition to our collection is this letter, which is featured in our new exhibit that I'll talk a little bit about throughout the presentation. Now, 1773, the Henrys are at Scotchtown. Sarah Henry is still alive. And Patrick Henry receives a letter from a Quaker abolitionist named Robert Pleasance. He asks Henry, we can tell from this response letter here, he asks Patrick Henry what are his thoughts and views on slavery. And Patrick Henry chooses to write him back in a very candid and personal letter describing his thoughts about the subject of slavery. Now, Patrick Henry's original letter, we are not sure if it exists today. It is not extant in any archival collection that we know of, but there are 3 that I know of copy letters that exist in archival collections in both the US and the UK. This is one such letter that exists. Because Patrick Henry outlined his thoughts on slavery and, most importantly, proclaimed his own self-hypocrisy of knowing that slavery was a deplorable and lamentable practice, but he could not go on without it. This letter, his response was copied and spread around to various, we think, Quaker congregations across the Eastern Seaboard. This letter came up for auction in 2023, and we were able to purchase it. Interestingly, you see the words Wood Street across the top of the letter, and that I've been able to trace to the Quaker Meeting House in Burlington, New Jersey, which was really only a handful of miles away from the auction house I purchased it from. So my thought is that this letter then was circulated at that particular meeting house so that the people attending it could read Patrick Henry's words and ponder his thoughts on slavery. It's a really powerful letter, and as I said, it is on exhibit right now, so please do come visit us to learn more about it. All right. So we're moving right along in the Henry family's lives here at Scotchtown. And in 1774, a changing tide is coming over Virginia. We like to situate Patrick Henry's life at Scotchtown in parallel with these very important things that were happening across the colonies as they gradually moved towards revolution. In 1774, Patrick Henry leaves Scotchtown, travels up to Mount Vernon to meet with George Washington and Edmund Pendleton to go to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. While they're there, Henry and others draft a petition to King George III listing the colonists' grievances. This is a very important part, and it's so exciting to think about the fact that Patrick Henry was living at our house when he is going up to Philadelphia to do this work. But unfortunately, at this time, there is unease at home. Things are not well. We know that Sarah Henry had an illness, and it likely lasted for several years until her death. And in October of 1774, when Patrick Henry was in Philadelphia, his sister, Annie Henry Christian, writes to her sister-in-law, Anne Christian Fleming, "The children are all well. My brother Pat is not returned from Philadelphia, yet his wife is extremely ill." And this is the only time that Sarah's illness is mentioned in a letter that survives that we know of, talking about what was going on here at Scotchtown. Patrick Henry was away a lot of the time, and it was up to the women of the Henry family to run the plantation, manage the enslaved population, teach the children. And when Sarah was ill, we know that his sisters and mother were there helping out. This was a family effort. And this letter is really our best insight into the fact that Sarah Henry was ill, but we really don't know what she had. Of course, 1775 hits, and the tragedy that most people know of strikes, and that is that Sarah Henry dies. Of course, we don't know when she died, we don't know how she died, and we don't know where she's buried. But I like to invite visitors to the house to think about the ages of the Henry children when Sarah Henry died. Martha was 20, she was married. John was 18, William was 12, Annie was 8, Betsy was 6, and Nettie was just 4 years old. And they have lost their mother. And they've likely gone through a period of time where she was struggling. And this household was probably really sad. They were in mourning. They were upended. And meanwhile, Patrick Henry is out in the colony and in Philadelphia trying to bolster support for the colony's grievances against the royal government. So we know that Sarah Henry has died probably around the turn of the year. On January 21st, 1775, the Virginia Gazette advertises the Second Virginia Convention is meeting in Richmond. And this is, again, right when Sarah Henry has died. So Patrick receives this notice that he has got to go to Richmond. He's going to Henrico Parish Church, which we now know as St. John's Church, and he has to gain support for a revolutionary cause. Yet he's going through all of this emotional turmoil at home. Of course, he goes, and that's when we get the very famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. I have thought about this a lot recently, and so have all of our staff at Scotchtown. And I really think that Sarah's death might have had a big influence on Patrick Henry taking the leap to pressure his fellow delegates to call for an armed revolution. He was teetering on the brink here. He had just had a huge loss. He was emotional. Maybe that was what turned him to make that bold statement. We might never know, but I think that the two are certainly connected. Now, after the speech is given, we have the gunpowder incident. And again, this is all happening while the family is living at Scotchtown. So there is so much going on. The women at home are very well aware of what's happening. And they know that everything Patrick Henry says in public is endangering him, and it thus is endangering them at home. So they are not immune to any of the musings and turmoil that's going on in the public realm of their family. It's directly impacting this private side of their family too. So on May 21st, or April 21st, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, decides to pull all of the gunpowder out of the public powder magazine in Williamsburg. That is the building we see on the background of this slide here. This enrages the colonists, and it definitely enrages Patrick Henry. And therefore, Patrick Henry gathers up the Hanover militia. Militias across the colony do the same, and they all march towards the gunpowder magazine to demand that the gunpowder be returned to them. Now, Patrick Henry probably left Scotchtown, maybe went down to Hanover Courthouse, where they would have probably met to then lead on to their march. So again, I like to always connect it back to Scotchtown. And by April 21st, about a week later, a week after Dunmore has pulled the gunpowder out, they get word of the skirmish at Lexington and Concord. And this is a very timely thing to talk about right now, because the skirmish in Lexington and Concord happened on the 19th, which is coming up in just a couple of days. So by the 28th, the Virginians get news of this skirmish, and that further incites them to continue marching towards the powder magazine. Patrick Henry and the Hanover militia keep at it. Many militias fall away, but Patrick Henry will not back down. He gets there. They meet with the governor's representative, and they are given 330 pounds and a receipt to acknowledge the fact that they were reimbursed for the loss of that gunpowder. But perhaps my favorite result of this is this proclamation that you see here that Dunmore posted against Patrick Henry after this. It's very dramatic, and it's full of very actionable words. He says, "Whereas I have been informed from an undoubted authority that a certain Patrick Henry of the county of Hanover and a number of deluded followers have taken up arms, chosen their officers, and styling themselves as an independent company, have marched out of their county, encamped, and put themselves in a posture of war." This is a loaded proclamation, and Patrick Henry is directly called out by the governor of Virginia for his actions. Again, think about the women at home when they get their copy of this and they think, oh my gosh, what is going on? What is going to happen with Patrick Henry? What is going to happen with us at this time? Now, 1776, we all know important things happened this year. As we move forward, By June 1776, the 5th Virginia Convention elects Patrick Henry the first governor of the independent Commonwealth of Virginia. Patrick Henry and his family are still residing at Scotchtown at this time. We know he's out traveling around the Commonwealth again, and he is still a part of the Virginia Conventions. And he is the first governor of Virginia, and that is a huge honor, but a huge burden to bear. He is run down, and he comes down with, to them, bilious fever, what we now know of as malaria, and he heads back to Scotchtown for 2 months. So he is, in fact, governor of Virginia and living at Scotchtown with his family. And we know that people were coming to visit him there for government concerns and issues that needed addressed. So perhaps Scotchtown is the first governor's mansion. That could be said too. Now, they know they have to move to Williamsburg. And not only does this displace the family, moves them away from their home, but it also moves the enslaved population. We're not sure how many of the enslaved were moved to Williamsburg with them, but definitely a good number of them were, because their names show up in various account books that still exist in the Williamsburg archives today. This is probably an emotional time for them, but also an exciting time. This is an illustration that an artist drew for our new exhibit, showing that this impacted not only Patrick Henry and the children that were living there, but Beck and Dinah and Pedro and Ben as well. So, as I said, September, Patrick Henry is recovered from malaria, and they head to Williamsburg. And there's a really nice note in a letter from George Washington where he says, "I congratulate you, sir, most cordially upon your appointment to the government, and with no less sincerity on your late recovery." So it's just a nice sentiment thought to think that George Washington was certainly very invested and involved in Patrick Henry and his success at this time period. Now, as I said, they're moving to Williamsburg, and they are moving here. They are moving into the palace that was previously, very recently occupied by the royal governor. So while their house at Scotchtown was big, this house was really big, and it was luxurious and probably nicer than any place they'd ever stayed before. I'd love to know what the children thought when they moved into this home, and what did the enslaved think when they were moving into this home as well. These are things that are just not necessarily present in the archive today, but maybe they'll come up as we further explore. So Patrick Henry is the governor. It's a 1-year term. He's reelected, and he realizes that he is probably not going to live at Scotchtown again. In a memoir from somebody who met Patrick Henry a little bit later in life in the 1780s, he writes that Patrick Henry told him he had left Scotchtown because it reminded him too much of Sarah and her death, and it was too heavy for him to bear. So Scotchtown goes up for auction again, or goes up for sale again. And we have the advertisement once again in the Virginia Gazette, listing the pleasant and healthy seat called Scotchtown. So this is an advertisement from March of 1778. And again, our friend Colonel Sim shows up, acting as sort of an estate agent, a sale agent for him. And I think it's really interesting to note that they say they will accept both enslaved people or money as payment for this property. And then a few months later, Patrick Henry and Dorothea Dandridge wed. And he did still own Scotchtown when they were married, and the sale happened a little bit after that. So we do think Dorothea probably was familiar with the house and would have been there at least a few times before it was sold. Now, between 1778 and 1800, there are a number of short-lived owners of Scotchtown, and we know some about them, but there's definitely more to explore. We have two owners not connected to each other, Wilson Miles Carey and Benjamin Forsyth. So Wilson Miles Carey owned Scotchtown from about 1778 to 86. And he was the one who did purchase it from Patrick Henry. He lists it for sale and for rent several times over this 78 to 86-ish time period. So we don't have a ton of information on if he was actually living there, if he had renters there most of that time. It's a little bit foggy, but he was the owner for a significant amount of time. Even shorter lived was Benjamin Forsyth, who purchases Scotchtown in 960 acres. Now, this is down quite a bit from that original 10,000 acre plot that Charles Chisholm had received in the land grant in 1717. So you can tell that over the years, parcels have been sold off, and we're down to 960 acres that are associated with Scotchtown, the house. We know so little about Benjamin, and then our archival records are indicating that he probably was in North Carolina by the mid-1790s and not at Scotchtown. Now, in 1801, the Shepherd family purchases Scotchtown and move in, and they are the longest tenure of ownership at Scotchtown, this family, as they were the last private owners of this house in the 20th century as well. So Captain John Mosby Shepherd purchases Scotchtown, moves his family and many, many enslaved servants to the property. He adds outbuildings to the plantation, without a doubt. And one of the best primary sources we have from this time period are, in fact, insurance records that John Shepherd took out on the property. And there's one shown here, and you can see the large house at the bottom, and then you see we have kitchen and a laundry. We have one quarters building that shows up on an insurance plot for a little bit later on, and we are hopefully going to be doing some archaeological investigation at that site in the future. These insurance maps give us the best view of how the property physically was changed in the 19th century. Now, you might have noticed in the background of some of my slides, there's a very interesting drawing, and that is in fact this piece here, which is part of our collection, and it is a plat map, or as it says, a plot of Scotchtown that was drawn about 1820 during the Shepherd family's tenureship here. It is a really amazing glimpse into Scotchtown and the surrounding area, and as you can see, it has these very quaint illustrations. This map was done by a man named John J.D.G. Brown, John Brown, who was a neighbor to the Shepherd family at Scotchtown. This is a zoom close-up look at his depiction of Scotchtown, again, around 1820. So we're probably looking at about 40 years after Patrick Henry's tenure here at the plantation. So we have the large house in the center. We have the kitchen and laundry buildings that were on the insurance maps. We have a well house in the bottom left corner, probably a dairy of some sort in the top right. And then we have what was very likely a quarters building in the bottom left right corner. And right above that is an ice house. And we love this image because it shows so much detail about the property. This lovely drawing was also made by John Brown and is also part of our collection today. And as you can see in both drawings, by the 19th century, there is a lean-to on the, this would be the east end of the house that was there through the 20th century. So this family probably built that lean-to addition on the side of the house in the 19th century. I like to show this picture here, newly revealed to us from an area collector. And this picture is Harriet Isabella Shepherd. Of course, she's a little bit later in life here. And she was the daughter of John Shepherd. And she married one John D.G. Brown, the neighbor and creator of these illustrations. So we like to think that he was maybe coming around drawing these, and maybe that's how he met Harriet. And we know that they were married in 1824 at Scotchtown, so that's about 4 years after this plat map is drawn. Now, after John Shepherd dies, ownership transfers to his daughter and her husband. And so that's where the Taylor name comes into play. And the Taylor family owned Scotchtown until Preservation Virginia buys it in the 20th century. This is a photo of Lavinia Shepherd Taylor, who was, again, a sister of Harriet and daughter of John Shepherd. And she and her husband owned Scotchtown for quite some time. They owned and ran the plantation for several decades. Her husband, John Taylor, died in 1858. And interestingly, Lavinia still resides at Scotchtown. We have one document that indicates that her son, Edmund, owned 21 enslaved people. And it's my assumption that those 21 people were living and working at Scotchtown with Edmund and his mother, Lavinia. By 1870, we have a document that shows Lavinia is still the head of the household at Scotchtown and that her real estate value holdings are $10,000. So again, this is telling me that she is still the owner of Scotchtown, and that probably Edmund and his family are living there with them. Now, Lavinia dies in 1877. So we know that this photo predates the 1877 date. Now, Edmund is then the head of household. Remember, he is the daughter of Lavinia. Not too long after that, his daughter, also Lavinia, who is referred to as Livy, is listed as the head of the household, while Edmund and Lizzie, her parents, live with her. They die, her parents, Edmund and Lizzie, by 1905, and Livy Taylor is living at and owns Scotchtown. Unfortunately, she dies in 1909, but her sister, Sally Taylor, is still alive at this time. Now, we're still figuring out the exact timeline of who was living in Scotchtown at this time. But we do know that in 1931, Sally Taylor was admitted to Western State Hospital as a patient there. And then she died in 1941. So those are the two sisters who are the last private owners of Scotchtown. And again, we're at 1941 by the time Sally dies. This is what we're left with. This is such a haunting picture of Scotchtown, and it was not in good shape. I don't have the exact date of of this photo, but we do know that after the sisters had both left the property, that there were a variety of both sanctioned and unsanctioned tenants, the most favorite being an unusual pair that inhabit the old mansion. And that is when our long-storied goat men are living in Scotchtown. This is a photo of one of them. And it was recently kind of brought to our attention in Red Hills files that this photo existed, and we found a good copy of it. So Scotchtown is more or less abandoned, and these interesting men are living here, and supposedly their goats are living in the basement. Maybe they're in the main part of the house as well. But as you can see from this photo, it is in rough shape. I also want to show these photos, which are two of my favorite. And this, I believe, is Perry in the middle of these folks on the left. And of course, this is one of his goats on the right. And I think he brings a lot of character to the house. And this photo, it's one of my favorites. Now, people know that Scotchtown is in bad shape, and eventually it goes to auction. And the APVA at the time, which is now Preservation Virginia, was run as a branch system. And the local branch in Hanover County decides they want to buy Scotchtown and establish it as a, quote, shrine to Patrick Henry. Scotchtown goes on the auction block. And as you can see, there is a lot of work to do if it is acquired. This is an actual photo from the day of the auction, and it's people going into the house to preview it. From what I have read and been told, many of the floors were completely rotted out. A lot of the joists were no longer stable. So I'm not sure how safe it was to go into the house at this time period, but they still made it in there. We purchase it, and it is restored. We purchased it in 1958, and we purchased it at auction for the price of $37,000, which was a huge amount of money in the 1950s. So it's impressive that they pulled that together. Walter M. Maycomer is the main restoration architect of the house. There was a significant amount of work done. And as you can see, there was a lot had been changed structurally to the chimneys. Those were restored back to the 18th century. I love this woman here on the right cleaning the window frame with her kerchief on her head. And the men on the left who are refitting the original paneling back into the formal rooms and then sistering them with reproduction paneling in places where the original was missing. Now, Scotchtown opens to the public in 1963, and we have been open as a museum ever since. Between 64 and 75, a number of outbuildings were reconstructed because by the time of our purchase, they were all gone. So right now we have a reconstructed ice house, laundry building, which is now our museum shop, and kitchen. And then our most recent construction is a new roof that was installed in 2023. So that is the end of my formal presentation. And I'd be happy to address any questions now that might have come up.
All right. Well, Elyse, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. And we do have a question to start us off. This one is from Pat Brown here. And we're asking, didn't Sarah suffer from madness? I know it's a very common question.
Yeah. And to answer that, the way we interpret Sarah's illness at Scotchtown is we solely focus on primary sources. We have no 18th century records that indicate it was a madness, but the first mentioning of some sort of mental distress actually comes about 68 years after her death in a publication called A Pioneer's Sketchbook, where the son of a doctor who was attending the Henry family at Scotchtown mentioned that Sarah had lost her reason. And again, that is 68 years after her death. We don't say that it's not true by any means. And certainly she very likely did have some sort of mental distress, but we just don't have a lot of evidence to support that either way. And rather than speculate and make her life kind of dramatized, or adding folk and lore to her life, we like to talk about Sarah as a strong, smart, independent woman that she probably was before she was ill. She raised her children there. She probably ran that plantation. She was well educated. You know, she and Patrick Henry had, from all that we know, a very strong marriage and union. And she would have had to have been such an amazing woman to build that life with him. And I think that's more important to talk about than speculating on something I just don't know.
And I know you guys are doing a really great job at dispelling a lot of those local myths that have come about as a result of those really later interpretations of her life.
Mm-hmm.
All right, another question here. This person's asking if Scotchtown was Dolly Madison's home, childhood home, and if so, during what years?
Yeah, so I would put that in another category of myth and legend. It was said for many years that Dolly Madison's father and had lived there with his family, and she mentions it in her reminiscences later in life. And she mentions a home with marble fireplaces and grand, just grand architectural features that doesn't really match the Scotchtown that we know today. More than likely, if they were at Scotchtown, they were probably there visiting, or briefly might have stayed there sort of between the Chisel, Robinson, and Henry era. So that's, again, a little bit dubious to us, but no, we do not longer say that. We don't say that this was Dolly Madison's childhood home anymore.
All right, got another question here. This one's about land. How was the land grant sold or parceled off?
Are we referring to Chisel's land grant?
I would assume just how it, came from the 10,000 acres to the 960, how that land was split apart over time.
Over time, yeah, I think when Patrick Henry bought it, it was about 1,000 acres that Patrick Henry bought. So by the time he buys it, it had already really been sold off. I think the bulk of it is being sold off in the Chisel and Robinson years, particularly when that 10,000 or 100,000 pound debt is trying to be fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, again, I think we have maybe a little over 40 acres now. So we have even less than that 1,000 acres that was the Shepherd family when they owned it. So.
All right, great. Couple more questions here. This one's from Sydney. I'm interested in what you said about how you analyze how old the home is. Could you explain that again?
Sure. So this is, it's called dendrochronology. You can look it up. It's really, really interesting. We have a director of architecture who handled that project, but basically what happens is when you want to get an exact date on a piece of wood in a house, you can hire a consultant who does a lot of data analysis and scientific examination. They will take a piece of wood, a core slice of wood from a large beam in the house, and they then take that core slice of wood with the tree rings, and they can compare it to other tree rings from the region to try and match up with years based on rainfall. Tree rings are different sizes. Scientists and data people can look at that and then tell you exactly a year. Unfortunately, we only got one good sample out of the house because, as I said, it was in rough shape when we restored it. And so a lot of the wood actually has bug damage. So we're hoping to get a better date on the whole house, hopefully in the next few years. But right now, we just can't say conclusively when Scotchtown was built. Just that one small part of the house, the east end, has a date. So I hope that answered that question.
All right. Yeah, that's a very interesting process, and it goes way over my head.
Yes, science.
Yes. All right, got one from Paul here. Why do we not know where Sarah is buried? Could she be buried on the grounds of Scotchtown or perhaps a local church cemetery?
It's possible. We don't even have the date of Sarah's death, so we don't have any document that's recording that. She could have been buried at Scotchtown. She could have been buried at her family's house, not too far away. She could have been. I don't think she was buried at Fork Church nearby because they have a good number of their records still extant today, but it's a mystery, and we might not never get the answer to it. So it's a shame, but it's just one example of the many things that have been lost to history.
All right, great. Well, Elyse, that is just about all we have time for. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you to all the folks at home who tuned in. As you know, you can catch Red Hill Rediscovered every month on a new topic around Patrick Henry, Red Hill, everything in between. So again, Elyse, thank you, and join us again next month, folks.
Thanks, Cody.